Damn it. Oh, hey, didn't see you guys there. Welcome back to another episode here at the stable. And before we get started, let's just address the elephant in the room. The orange go-kart sitting behind us. Yes, I caught the bug and ended up getting myself a go-kart. This is just one of those things that my inner child needed to have. But it is not the topic of this video, so let's get it out of the way. Instead, the subject of this video is this piece of crap that we call ScrapStang. If you're new here, you can clearly see that this car is no longer stock, but the suspension isn't really what I would consider to be the best upgrade of this car. Instead, it's these guys. These are custom motor mounts that we built specifically to relocate the original position of the engine 5 inches down and 6 inches back. And of course, moving a 500-pound engine to somewhere it wasn't originally designed to be comes with some issues. For starters, we had to design and fabricate new motor mounts for the new engine position. But since the engine and the transmission go bolted together, that means we also had to design and fabricate a new transmission mount and crossmember. And since the engine was pushed so far back, that means we had to notch and modify the firewall, and that's why this patch was created. So we got those 3 key modifications for the engine relocation complete, but that just leaves us with one that I've been dreading, and it involves this guy. See, this is a manual steering rack, literally the most simple design for steering. There's no hydraulic lines for power steering or anything like that. You see, it just gets a little confusing when the instructions and reality don't quite correlate, because all over the website it emphasizes that the manual rack does not come with bushings. And what do you know, mine came with pre-installed bushings. Well, sweet, that just means there's one less step we have to do, right? Wrong. Wrong, because the instructions specifically state that the flange end of the bushing has to go towards the crossmember, and would you look at that, when installed in the correct position, the flange end of the bushing is literally on the wrong side. So the website says the manual rack does not come with bushings, but it did, and not only that, they came on backwards. But luckily, this should be an easy fix. And just like that, swap it around. All set. All right, well, with the bushings now in the correct orientation, I'm gonna install the rack. I'm getting too old for this. And I made a mistake the last time we put this steering rack on. The first time we installed the rack, we also installed it with the 3/4 spacers, but it turns out the manual rack does not require the spacers, and that confusion wasn't due to the instructions fault, that was my fault. So the goal for this video is to connect this steering wheel to the steering rack we just installed. Sounds simple enough, right? With the short distance between the rack and the column, but it's this short distance that will create the most problems because of this 400-pound obstacle that we're about to throw in. You guys ready to see one of the biggest mistakes, probably the biggest mistake that I've made on this build? Going back to the engine relocation and all the things we had to do in order to make sure everything worked. When we were doing our initial mock-up and test fitment of the engine relocation, we did have the steering rack installed in order to know it didn't make contact with the oil pan. But when we were doing that initial fitment, the steering rack was installed with those spacers and with the bushings on backwards, which also means that now, with the bushings in the correct orientation and no spacers, the oil pan now comes into contact with the steering rack. I mean, in order to correct that, we'd have to redesign the engine mounts, the transmission mounts, and everything we've been doing for the past year. But we're not gonna do that. I added a couple spacers until that rack did not make contact with the oil pan. That equals to about 3/4 of an inch, which is the amount of the spacer that we had installed before. I spoke to a couple people, including some experts over at Speedway Motors, and they stated that adding a spacer to the rack would not have any negative implications to the steering geometry or add bump steer, because those spacers are pushing the rack horizontally rather than vertically. We don't have to completely redesign everything again. It's okay to run those spacers on that steering rack. Okay, we can now get back to the point of this video, the steering joints. You can see that our factory steering column already wouldn't even work with our setup. It's coming into contact with the headers. So before we start installing these joints, let's get that steering column issue addressed. So in order to get this job done correctly, we're gonna need a couple ingredients. First off, I wanna give a huge thanks to Borgeson for sending out this last minute Christmas gift and of course helping us out with the ScrapStang. First thing we're gonna need is a 3/4 inch double D shaft, which is basically just a 3/4 inch rod with 2 flat sides. The next thing we will need is a universal joint to connect our steering rack to that double D shaft we talked about earlier, and in our case it will be a 9/16 26 spline female end, and on the other side it will be a 3/4 inch double D female end as well. Next up is another universal joint, and this one is the same on both sides and it's meant to fit that double D 3/4 inch shaft. Then we get to our shaft support bearing, which is necessary if you're running more than 2 of these universal joints. Our third U joint once again has that 3/4 inch double D shaft female end, but on the other side it has a 3/4 inch 30 spline female end, and this one is meant to directly slip on to the steering shaft coming out of the column. And speaking of column, with this kit that Borgeson sent us, we will be able to retain our original steering column, which is the look that I was going for. So let's see how this all works together. Well, to start off, we're obviously going to need to shorten the steering column regardless of what system we were installing, because it's making contact with the headers. The steering column is bolted on under the dash, and I'm going to make my cut probably around a 1/4 inch from the firewall. Let's go ahead and take this sucker out. And if we line up the shaft alongside the steering column, and I just lined it up where the full length of these splines right here are going to pop out enough for the steering wheel to grab. And as you can see on the other side, our guesstimation was damn near spot on with the amount that's going to stick out of the column after we cut it. I'm also gonna leave a little bit extra because we could always cut some more, but we can't really add it back. All right, let's see what it looks like installed. I say that's about good. If anything, we could cut a little extra. And this is the bushing included in the kit in order to use the stock column. It's a direct fit on the column even after you cut it. And that's in order to support the new shaft that goes in the column and keep it directly centered. And in order to keep the column itself centered, we're gonna be using this retainer that was included in the kit, and you can see it looks pretty damn close to the original, but it just has a smaller hole. And this tab right here is going to be bent inwards like this, and I'll show you guys what that's for in a sec. And this plate is just going to be a direct replacement to the other one. And then of course, the shaft will go directly through it. And the little tab we bent out earlier is going to be used to secure the column onto that retaining plate. All right, now we're gonna insert the shaft. You guys are gonna have to excuse all the wiring mess of, obviously we're in the middle of the project, but the shaft is now inside the column, and you can see that there's just enough thread going through there for us to get a steering wheel nut on there. But on the other end, you can see that the splines aren't really coming out. So we gotta cut it a tiny bit more, maybe about a 1/2 inch to 3/4. I went ahead and cut precisely 3/4 all the way around and then filed it down so we won't have any jagged, sharp edges. All right, shaft is back in, and look at that, the 3/4 inch reduction gave us plenty of spline there. Now we grab the corresponding U-joint, 30 spline, 3/4 inch, and 3/4 inch double D. And this bad boy is gonna slip on just like that. And taking a closer look at the U-joint and shaft setup, you want the shaft itself to be flush with this surface. So as you can see, it's protruding just a tiny bit, but if we go ahead and give it a little push, you can see that the end of the shaft is now parallel with this joint. And look at that, we still have a little bit of room in here, maybe about a 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch. All right, this is now where the real fun starts, because now we have a point A and a point B, and we have to fill in whatever goes in between. Now we're gonna mock up the U-joint that goes on the steering rack, which again is the 9/16 26 spline. Now we figure out how we're gonna connect this one to that one. So this is the point where some people will grab their double D shaft. So we're at the point where you would usually start cutting the double D shaft to size, but I'm not going to do that, and I'll tell you why. This shaft is a one-shot deal, meaning that you have to get it right the first time. If not, you're gonna have to buy another one, and that could get expensive pretty quick. But since I know I'm not perfect, and odds are I will cut it wrong, I got myself some test pieces. These are 3/4 inch round pieces of wood I got from Hobby Lobby, and they are coincidentally the same exact length as our double D rod. No, we aren't making our steering components out of wood. This isn't a pirate ship, but rather than cutting our metal double D, we're gonna go ahead and use these for mock-up. And for those of you wondering how we're gonna get this round peg to fit in the double D shape, we're simply just gonna grind it down until it has roughly the same shape as the double D. And just like that, we have now simulated the double D shape. And we could go ahead and test fit it and make sure it works. And look at that. It's locked and loaded in there. I feel this is a great way to do this because it reduces the chance of you messing up your double D rod, and these things were only like $2, so. All right, so with the car propped up now, we have to figure out where we want to add the third and last universal joint. Also, one very important thing to note when deciding the placement for these U-joints is you don't want any of them to be past a 35-degree angle or it will cause binding or hard spots. You also want to keep in mind that these protrude a bit, so when this thing is spinning, you want to make sure it doesn't make contact with anything in its full rotation. And with those things in mind, we can now start talking about placement. As you can see from the underside, we have our U-joint coming off of the steering rack, and if we look over here, we have our U-joint coming off of the steering column. So I'm thinking the easiest path for the steering shaft to take is under the engine mount and in between the frame and the headers, and that will take us to the steering column. So that means that this guy would have to sit roughly about right here. So we have one straight shot from the rack to the U-joint and then another straight shot from the U-joint to the steering column. So if this guy's gonna be placed somewhere about right here, let's say roughly 7 inches. Also, I just want to mention that when measuring the distance between the two U-joints to determine the shaft length, I'm going to measure off of this plane, this surface right here, to the same surface on the other side, because remember the shaft has to be flush with this plane right here, so we're measuring off of that. Okay, so we're back with our 7-inch piece here, and we're gonna go ahead and install it like if it was some regular double D rod. So at this point, we also want to look at what's around us. If we were to mount it right here, we would come into contact or wouldn't be able to slip a nut onto this bolt. This bolt is actually a little too long. We're going to replace that anyway, but we got to think about things that might get in the way. So from this U-joint to the steering column, we're at about 9 inches. All right, so with the new 9-inch piece installed, I think we're looking pretty good here. The angles don't look too abrupt. Adding any length to either of these rods will increase this angle, but we have plenty of clearance. I mean, it's a little bit, but it's plenty. This isn't really supposed to move between the header and the frame right here. This is what it looks like from the top side. It's not very visible, but it's looking good. And next up, we have to find a location for this guy. And the reason for this shaft support bearing is with those 3 universal joints, if we spin the wheel right now, they're just gonna flop around. So we have to find a place to mount the support, and I'm pretty sure it has to be somewhere near this middle universal joint. I think something like this should work. So shaft support bearing is in. I'm thinking right here would work real nice because it's out of the way and it'd be easy to make a bracket that goes right here. All right, so I busted out the fancy Amazon cardboard and I've made a template of a little bracket. That way we could get a nut on both sides and it's still close to the U-joints and it's just slightly lifted off of the frame. Alrighty, we have now duplicated our bracket into the metal form. It is not exactly the prettiest, but it'll do. Alrighty folks, as you can see, the bracket is in. I might have made it a little too big, but that doesn't really matter. Also, ignore these welds right here. That was when we just started the project. We might grind those down later. But we're gonna go ahead and tack this and see how it does. Oh. All right, that support bearing is now tacked in, so it shouldn't go anywhere. So that means it should do its job. So if we turn the steering wheel Nice. I'm not feeling any binding or hard spots. And keep in mind, we're still using the wood sticks. Holy crap, that's good. All right, so now that the steering is pretty much functional, you guys know what that means, right? Now we get to grab our shaft. Alrighty folks, the metal rods are in, but before I show you guys, so we can get a better look, I'm gonna go ahead and remove the engine. Alrighty folks, with the big hunk of engine out of the way, we can now see our work. Let's go ahead and give the steering wheel a nice little turn. Look at that. Look at that. All the U-joints are working really well together. Nothing's binding, there's no hard spots. Now check this out. Ka-chow! Look at that. Yeah, baby. Look at that. Yes, sir, indeed, we got steering. There's some minor adjustments we still have to do, as well as finish up welding the rod support bearing. But holy crap, am I happy about how this turned out. Yeah! I'm not gonna say it was the easiest thing to do, but I mean, it was pretty straightforward. And we also have to put a tiny dimple with a drill bit on these areas where these locking screws go. Also, going back to the U-joints not being able to exceed 35 degrees, it is very difficult to measure the degree change when they're on different planes. But what I did is I got a random metal rod I had laying around the shop, put it on a vise, and bent it until it was at a 30-degree angle. We can compare it to what we have here, and it's still under those 35 degrees. Again, huge thanks to Borgeson for sending over these parts, as well as Jeff over at Borgeson for educating us on these components, as well as what would work best for our application. I know we said this turd was gonna be driving under its own power by the end of the year. Sadly, it looks like we're not gonna make that deadline, but I'm not even mad about it because we've made some insane progress considering the budget that we have, as well as the fact that I have another job. We've only gotten to this point because of you guys, our Patreons, and the companies that help us with this build. With that being said, I wish you guys a happy holidays. Thank you guys for hanging out. We'll see you on the next one.